They came on a Tuesday, which later struck the survivors as the most offensive part of it. Not a Friday, not a Sunday, not some dramatic date humans could fold into mythology. A Tuesday in late October, 7:42 in the morning, while Kenji Den was on his third train of the commute, standing between a salaryman in a gray suit and a schoolgirl with a backpack shaped like a cartoon rabbit, his head throbbing from the night before, and a half-empty can of beer, warm in his coat pocket, because he'd missed the trash can at the station and didn't want a litter. He was that kind of man. Thoughtful in the small ways, chaotic in the large ones. The kind of man who would go out of his way to carry a warm can of beer he didn't want through an entire commute, rather than leave it on a platform, somewhere for someone else to clean up. The lights went out first. Not the train's lights, those stayed on. The lights outside. Every street lamp, every neon sign, every office window, every blinking tower light on every building in the Tokyo skyline. All of it, all at once, gone. The train slowed. People looked up from their phones. The schoolgirl with the rabbit backpack pressed her face to the window and said, very quietly, "What is that?" Kenji looked. The thing was larger than anything he had a word for. He would try later when people asked. He would say a mountain, and they would nod, and he would say no, not like a mountain that was also a city, a mountain that had decided it was done being a mountain, and had chosen instead to become a problem. It moved with the deliberate, measured certainty of something that had never in its existence been required to hurry. Its body, if body was even the right word, if any word humans had made was the right word for this, was a dark, mottled architecture of shapes that refused to resolve into anything the eye could comfortably parse. Limbs that were also perhaps sensors, a torso that was also perhaps a weapon system, a head, if that flat, rotating aperture at the summit counted as a head, though it seemed less like a face and more like a targeting array that had evolved aesthetic sensibilities by accident. It stepped on the Shinjuku district at 7:44 a.m. The sound arrived 12 seconds later, not an explosion, not a crash. Something lower and more fundamental, a frequency that Kenji felt in his back molars and the soles of his feet even through the train floor, even through the rubber soles of his shoes. The building that housed the company he worked for, a mid-sized advertising firm on the 14th floor of a glass tower whose name he'd read on his own business card 1,000 times without particular feeling, ceased to exist in any architecturally meaningful sense. The train stopped completely. The doors opened. This was either automated safety response or someone in a control room making a very good decision very fast. People began moving, which is what people do, not because moving is the right thing when a thing the size of a small geographic feature is stepping on the city, but because stillness is an option that the human body simply refuses to consider when the floor is shaking. Kenji stepped onto the platform. He still had the warm beer can in his pocket. He looked at the thing in the sky above the city and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that his Tuesday was going to get considerably worse before it got better. What he did not understand, what no one on that platform understood, what no government briefing or military intelligence report had yet begun to guess, was that the thing above Shinjuku was not the threat. The thing above Shinjuku was the distraction. His name in full was Den Kenji, which in the old reading of the kanji carried connotations of electrical current and second suns, though his parents had chosen it for neither reason and simply thought it sounded good. He was 31 years old, employed in copywriting, moderately talented, deeply unremarkable in most observable ways, and burdened with a physiology that his doctors had never been able to fully explain and that he had spent his entire adult life trying to manage with varying degrees of success. The condition, which no textbook named and no specialist had ever seen before, was this: in moments of genuine pleasure, not happiness, not satisfaction, not the dim contentment of a life proceeding adequately, but real pleasure, the electric, unguarded kind, his body did something it was not supposed to do. It grew, not metaphorically, not as a description of confidence or capability. His body, the physical object of it, expanded in all directions at a rate that had, on 3 documented occasions and several undocumented ones, caused significant structural damage to the immediate environment. The first time it happened, he was 19 and at a festival, and the girl he'd been in love with since junior high had kissed him under a paper lantern, while a band played something loud and good, and he had grown to approximately 4 stories in height before the shock of it. His shock, the girl's shock, the shock of everyone at the festival, interrupted whatever mechanism was responsible. He'd shrunk back down in about 20 minutes. His shoes were ruined. The girl had transferred schools. Since then, he had learned to manage it. Beer helped. Beer, he'd discovered through years of careful experimentation, produced the particular low-grade contentment that kept the condition at a stable threshold, present enough to feel, not so acute as to trigger. He kept beer in his coat pocket most mornings. He had a very good relationship with his local convenience store. The condition also, and this was the part that made it something other than a simple medical curiosity, came with a secondary effect. When the growth happened, when the full thing happened, the unmanaged surge of it, he became something other than himself. Not different in personality or memory or fundamental character, but differently capable. His skin hardened to a density that the government would later classify in a materials document that was never made public. His strength increased by an order of magnitude that the government would later classify in a separate document that was also never made public. His eyes, which were normally brown and slightly bloodshot from spending too much time in front of computer screens, became something that was less like eyes and more like instruments. He had a name for what he became, though he'd told exactly 2 people in his life. His older brother Juro, who had laughed until he cried and then taken it completely seriously and never mentioned it again except in moments of genuine crisis, and a woman named Sato Yuki, who had not laughed at all and had instead asked very precise questions about the mechanism of it that Kenji hadn't been able to answer. He called it Denace. He wasn't sure why. It was just the name that arrived the first time it happened, a name that felt, in the way that some things feel in the body before the brain has a chance to object correct. He had used it 3 times. 3 times in 12 years, always in situations that he could not have walked away from and lived with himself afterward. A building fire in Shibuya, in which he'd gotten 6 people out before the structure went. A ferry disaster in the harbor, 17 people, water cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. And once 5 years ago, a situation involving a man with a knife on a subway platform, and a group of children from an elementary school field trip, which had required less the superhuman capabilities and more the absolute certainty that he was not going to step back and let that happen. And the knife had bent on his forearm, and the man had run, and Kenji had gone home and drunk 4 beers and not thought about it for a week. He was not a hero. He had never told himself he was a hero. Heroes, in his understanding, were people who had chosen the thing, who had trained and prepared and built themselves deliberately toward a capacity for action. He was a man with a condition he hadn't asked for who sometimes used it because the alternative was unacceptable. There was a difference, he thought, even if no one else could see it from the outside. He thought about this while walking away from the train station with 20,000 other people, all of them moving in the same direction away from the thing in the sky, none of them looking back except him. He looked back because he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The creature, the Govan, though he wouldn't know that name for another 6 hours, was continuing its methodical destruction of the Shinjuku district with the focused attention of something executing a plan, rather than something acting on appetite. That was the first thing that registered. The thing wasn't hungry. It wasn't territorial. It wasn't afraid or aggressive in any way that Kenji recognized from biology or history or anything in his experience of the behavior of living things. It was working. The second thing that registered, and this one took longer, was the pattern of it. The creature wasn't destroying randomly. It was moving in a specific direction, stepping over certain structures and through others, and the structures it was stepping over shared a characteristic that took Kenji. Standing on a footbridge above a river of evacuating humanity, a full 4 minutes to identify, it was avoiding the hospitals. Not all of them, but the largest, the best equipped, the ones with the most visible emergency power generation on their rooftops. Those it walked around, which meant it had done reconnaissance, which meant it knew what it was looking at, which meant it was not simply a creature. It was an agent of something with intelligence and intent, and, most terrifying of all, patience. Kenji reached into his coat pocket. The beer was still there, warm from body heat. He turned it in his fingers for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it, the soft aluminum give of the can. He thought about what his brother had said once, early in the morning at the kitchen table of the apartment they'd shared in their 20s, after Kenji had explained the condition for the first time. So what you're saying is, the only thing standing between you and being actually superhuman is that you have to enjoy yourself first. Kenji had said that was a very reductive way of putting it. Gyro had said, but it's accurate. It was accurate. The problem was that at 7:58 on a Tuesday morning in October, with 20,000 people pressing against him on all sides and a thing the size of a small mountain, systematically destroying the district where he worked and several other districts besides, he was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, enjoying himself. He needed to find Jiro. Jiro was alive. Kenji found this out from a text message that arrived in fragments over the course of 40 minutes as the network attempted to cope with a load it had never been designed to handle. Fine. West exit. Bring if you have. Kenji read the last 3 words and understood them and felt, briefly, a kind of love for his brother that was too big and too immediate to do anything with except put away. He turned toward the west exit. The city was burning in discrete, precise patches, which was wrong. Fires spread. Fires consume and radiate and find paths. What Kenji could see from the footbridge was not a spreading fire, but a series of controlled burns, each one localized, each one maintained at a specific temperature and dimension. Something, was not destroying Tokyo. It was preparing Tokyo, clearing specific sites, establishing specific conditions. He started running. He found Jiro at the west exit of Shinjuku Station, sitting on a concrete barrier with a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled and dried and bled again, eating a convenience store rice triangle he'd apparently managed to acquire in the chaos with the serenity of a man who had decided that food was the most important problem at hand and had solved it. They looked at each other. "You look terrible," Jiro said. "You're bleeding. It's fine. It's a scratch." Jiro held out the other half of the rice triangle. "Eat something. You'll need it." "I need to. I know what you need to do. Eat something first." Jiro said it with the particular calm of a man who had grown up alongside a younger brother with an inexplicable condition and had spent 15 years developing the emotional infrastructure to be useful in situations that should not be possible. The thing isn't going anywhere. It's been in Shinjuku for 20 minutes and it's moved about 800 meters. You have time to eat a rice triangle. Kenji took the rice triangle. He ate it standing up, watching the creature through a gap between 2 buildings. Watching it work. "What is it doing?" Jiro asked. "I don't know, but it's not just destroying, it's clearing specific areas. Like it's setting up for something. Setting up for what? I don't know yet." Jiro was quiet for a moment. Around them, the evacuation was continuing. Waves of people moving in organized chaos, occasional shouts, the distant sound of emergency vehicles struggling through streets that were no longer passable in any conventional sense. A helicopter beat past overhead, low and fast, its spotlight sweeping the near buildings. "There's something else," Jiro said, and his voice had changed. Kenji looked at him. Jiro was pointing, not toward the creature in Shinjuku, but in the opposite direction, northwest, toward the residential districts. "I saw it maybe 10 minutes ago, before you got here. Smaller, much smaller, about the size of a large truck, moving fast, in and out of buildings, in and out, like it was looking for something specific, or someone." Kenji was already reassessing everything. 2 creatures. One large, drawing every eye, every camera, every military asset in the city. One small, moving fast through the residential zones while the world watched the big one. Classic misdirection. The kind of misdirection that required coordinated intelligence between 2 separate units operating with independent awareness of each other's role in the larger plan. These things were not animals. They were soldiers. "You need to go," Jiro said. "I need a beer first. I know." Jiro reached into his jacket, not Kenji's, and produced a can, room temperature, a convenience store brand that Kenji had always considered inferior to his preferred label, but which would, at this moment, serve the purpose perfectly. Jiro had been carrying it. He'd known, when he sent that text message, what the last 3 words meant. He'd gone and found a can and sat on a concrete barrier in the middle of a city that was being systematically prepared for unknown purposes by 2 alien entities operating in coordinated tactical deployment, and he'd waited. Kenji looked at his brother. He wanted to say something adequate. He didn't have adequate words. "Go," Jiro said. Kenji opened the can. He drank. The beer was warm and not very good, and he focused on the experience of it, the specific flat sweetness, the slight bitterness at the back of the throat, the warmth spreading through his chest, and let it work its low-grade alchemy. The familiar sensation built at the back of his skull, behind his sternum, in the palms of his hands. The threshold approaching, he let it approach. He let himself feel it. The small domestic pleasure of a mediocre beer on a cold morning in the company of his brother, who was alive, who had thought ahead, who was sitting on a concrete barrier in the middle of everything eating a rice triangle, with the composure of a man who had decided that the world might be ending, but lunch was still lunch. The world stretched, or he did. It was always hard to tell which way the perception went. Jiro watched the transformation the way he always had, quietly, with the look of a man cataloging data he didn't fully understand but refused to look away from. Kenji grew. The process was not graceful. It was not designed. It had never been designed. It was a thing that happened to him, not a thing he performed, and it showed in every aspect of it. The awkward geometry, The moments where his body seemed to negotiate with itself about how large it intended to become, the eventual settling into something stable and vast, his clothes shredded. This was an ongoing practical problem. His body resolved itself into the other thing. Den Ace, harder skinned and luminous in a way that came from within, the eyes gone gold and instrument precise. The hands capable of things that hands were not supposed to be capable of. He was approximately 30 meters tall. He looked down at Jirkuro, who looked up at him with an expression that had no name in either of their languages, something compounded of fear and pride and exasperation and the particular fondness that comes from sharing a childhood with someone who is inexplicable. Northwest, Jiro said, pointing. Kenji Den-Ace nodded once. Then he moved. The smaller creature was in Nerima by the time he reached it. He saw it from 3 blocks away, moving between a residential building and a school. Jiro had been right about the size. It was approximately the scale of a transit bus, low to the ground on 6 legs that moved with an unsettling fluid independence from each other, as if each limb was processing information and making decisions on its own. Its surface was the same dark, unresolvable architecture as the larger creature in Shinjuku, the same visual quality of something that refused to be fully parsed. But where the larger one had moved with geological deliberateness, this one was quick, hunting quick. The school was in the path. This was not ambiguous. Creature had located the school, had oriented itself toward it, and was moving with purpose. The kind of purpose that Kenji had observed in the larger creature's methodical clearing of Shinjuku, the focused, intelligent intentionality of something that knew exactly what it was doing. He didn't have time to think about why a school. He didn't have time to construct a theory. He had time to move. Den-Ace moved. The impact of his foot on the street between the creature and the school registered on seismographs in Saitama and Kanagawa. The creature stopped. It turned its front-facing aperture, that targeting array quality that both creatures shared, that flat, rotating face that was more instrument than feature, toward him it was assessing. He could feel the assessment, not in any way he could explain to another person, but feel it nonetheless, a scanning, a measuring, a rapid calculation of threat versus objective versus tactical cost. He had perhaps 2 seconds before it decided. He used those 2 seconds to do something that probably looked, from the air, from the news helicopter that was already arriving overhead, completely insane. He sat down, not in the path between the creature and the school. He maintained that position, his back essentially a wall between the creature and the building behind him. But he sat, cross-legged, in the way he used to sit as a child watching television on Saturday mornings. And he set his hands in his lap, and he looked at the creature. This is the part that no military briefing, no alien intelligence model, no xenobiology framework that any human organization had yet developed would have predicted, because it required something that none of those frameworks had accounted for, a read of the specific quality of the intelligence on the other side. Kenji had been watching the larger creature for 30 minutes. He had watched it work. He had watched the pattern of its choices, what it spared, what it destroyed, what it avoided, what it sought. And in that pattern, he had seen something he recognized, not the specific behavior, not the tactics, something underneath the tactics, something in the quality of the attention. The creature was afraid of being wrong. That was it. That was the thing he had read in the careful geometry of its destruction, in the deliberate avoidance of the hospitals, in the methodical, almost conservative pace of it. Whatever these things were, wherever they came from, whatever directive had sent them here, they were executing a plan they had been given, and they were executing it very carefully, and underneath the careful execution was the distinct behavioral signature of something that knew the cost of error and was not willing to pay it. He wasn't sure sitting down would work. He wasn't sure anything would work. But he was sure that the military response currently being coordinated across the city, tanks in the streets, aircraft overhead, the distant sound of an emergency broadcast commanding the remaining civilian population to shelter in place, was designed for something that destroyed indiscriminately, and what he was looking at did not destroy indiscriminately. He sat down. He looked at the creature. He waited. The creature held its position for 43 seconds. Kenji counted. Then it moved, not toward the school, not toward him, but sideways, angling away, and stopped again and turned that flat aperture back to him. It was as if it was testing something, seeing if he would interpret the movement as retreat and follow, as attack and preempt. He did neither. He remained seated. He maintained his position between the creature and the school, which was the only non-negotiable, and otherwise he was still. 43 more seconds. The creature made a sound. He had not expected sound. The sound came from somewhere inside its body, not from a mouth. It had no visible mouth, but from within. A vibration that moved through its structure and out through the air, low and complex, harmonics that he could feel in his now hardened chest wall but couldn't parse. It wasn't language in any sense he understood. It might not have been language at all. But it was communication. Something in the production of it was unmistakably deliberate. He produced a sound in return. The sound came from within him too, in the Dene state, not a growl, not a roar, not anything that his own nature had pre-equipped him with, but something that emerged from the same place the name had emerged from, the same place that knew this body before he did. A deep harmonic tone, a single sustained note, neither aggressive nor submissive. Present, attending, the creature was still for a very long time. Then it turned and walked away, not in the direction of the school, not in the direction of the larger creature. It walked southeast, toward the river, at a pace that was neither hurried nor aggressive, and it moved between buildings rather than through them, and Kenji watched it go and did not follow. The news helicopter had captured all of it. He would watch the footage later, from his brother's apartment, on a borrowed tablet, and he would not be able to explain to the journalist, who called him 6 times, what had happened in those minutes, any better than he could explain. The condition itself. He would say, I don't know, I just sat down. And the journalist would say, but why? And Kenji would think for a moment, and then say, because it was easier to fight something that was definitely going to fight back than to find out what would happen if I didn't. And I wanted to know what would happen if I didn't. The journalist would not use that quote, the Govan. The name arrived in a government briefing 3 days later, sourced from a transmission intercepted by a satellite array in Hokkaido that had been tracking unusual ionospheric disturbances since August, were not what anyone had thought they were. The transmission, partially decoded by a team of linguists, mathematicians, and a physicist from Tohoku University, who would later describe the experience as the most terrifying and exhilarating week of his life, did not contain coordinates or demands or declarations of war in any recognizable form. It was denser than that and less categorical. It took 6 weeks to reach a translation that any of the team had confidence in, and even that confidence was partial and qualified, but the core of it was this: assessment, resource cartography. The planet-designated untranslatable designation is undergoing preliminary evaluation for suitability as an untranslatable function. Assessment agents have been deployed. Standard protocol. No engagement expected. No engagement expected. The larger creature had withdrawn from Shinjuku at 11:15 a.m. on the same day it arrived, simply stepping backward into the bay and not surfacing again. The smaller creature, the one Kenji had sat down in front of, had done the same, entering the Tama River and disappearing without further incident. 17 people were dead. 2,341 were injured. 42 city blocks in Shinjuku were structurally compromised. The Tama River Bridge at Fuchu would need to be rebuilt. The government did not release the transmission publicly. They did not release the footage of Denace publicly either, at first, though the news helicopter footage was already circulating internationally before anyone could have stopped it, even if they'd wanted to. Kenji watched the footage on the borrowed tablet in his brother's apartment and drank a beer and felt, looking at the large luminous thing sitting cross-legged in the street in Nerima, something he didn't have a name for. Not pride, more like recognition. The thing in the footage looked like something that had been waiting a long time to be necessary. Jiro watched the footage beside him and said nothing for a while. Then he said, the news is calling you a hero. I know. How do you feel about that? Kenji thought about it. Uncomfortable. That's probably the right way to feel about it. They drank their beers. Outside, the city was beginning the enormous work of understanding what had happened to it. Emergency services were operating. Volunteers were operating. The ordinary machinery of a city, recovering from an injury, was cranking into motion, slow and imperfect and entirely human, and Kenji listened to it through the open window, the sirens and the generators and the voices, and felt something that was not quite comfort and not quite gratitude, but lived in the same neighborhood. They'll come back, he said. Jiro didn't argue. The transmission says assessment. It says no engagement expected, which means the assessment failed, which means they'll send someone to find out why. How long? I have no idea. Months? Years? I genuinely have no idea. Kenji turned the beer can in his hands, but I don't think it will be long. Whatever they were looking for, they were very efficient about it. And they stopped. He paused. Which is interesting. What's interesting about it? If they stopped, they didn't get what they came for. Which means whatever they need it intact. Which means they need us alive, Jiro said. Or something about us. Something that doesn't function if we're dead. They looked at each other. That's either very reassuring or very terrifying, Jiro said. Yes, Kenji said. It really is. The government contacted him 3 weeks later. Not the local government. Not even the national government, exactly. Though there were national government people in the room, a room in a building, in a district of Tokyo that didn't appear on any public map, which was a detail that he noticed and filed away without comment. The people in the room were a composite of things. Military uniforms and civilian clothes, and at least 2 people who were neither, who sat in the corners and said nothing, and had the quality of attention that Kenji associated with people who had been trained to process everything and reveal nothing. They had the footage. Of course they had the footage. They had footage he hadn't seen, from angles the news helicopter hadn't captured, government surveillance, satellite imagery, ground-level cameras from the buildings around the standoff in Nerima. They showed him the footage on a very large screen in that very quiet room and asked him to explain what had happened. He told them what he'd told the journalist. He told them about the pattern he'd observed in the larger creature's behavior. He told them about sitting down. He told them about the sound exchange. He did not use the name Den Ace. He was not yet sure he wanted to give these people that. The woman at the head of the table, sharp-featured, gray-haired, the kind of authority that comes from having been the smartest person in every room for 30 years, listened to all of it without interruption. When he finished, she said, "You assessed their threat calculus in real time and used a non-threatening posture to introduce cognitive uncertainty into their decision loop. I sat down because I didn't know what else to do," Kenji said. "Yes, and your assessment was correct. The action was effective." She paused. "Do you understand what that means? It means I got lucky. It means you read them." She leaned forward. "We have the best xenobiological modeling teams in the world in this building, Mr. Den. They have been analyzing the behavior patterns of these creatures since the moment the satellite array first detected anomalous approach signatures in August. They had 17 behavioral models. None of them predicted what you predicted. None of them predicted it was even possible." Kenji was quiet. "We think," she said, "that what you did may be more important than what you are." The ability, she chose the word carefully, with a slight pause that acknowledged she was aware of how insufficient it was, is significant. But the capacity to read them, to make a real-time assessment of their cognitive architecture, accurate enough to base a tactical decision on, that is extraordinary, and we need to understand it. I don't know how I did it. We know. That's part of what we need to understand. She slid a folder across the table. "We'd like you to work with us." Kenji didn't open the folder. "You said they'll come back." "We believe so, yes. Do your 17 behavioral models say anything about what they'll send next?" A pause, shorter than he expected, which meant she'd been expecting the question. "The working theory," she said, "is that the first deployment was survey. Assessment agents, as the transmission indicated. What comes next," another pause, this one longer, "is classified at a level that I can share with you if you agree to the arrangement in that folder." Kenji picked up the folder. He didn't open it. He set it on his knee and looked at her. "I need one thing." He said, "What's that?" "My brother works with me, not in a support role, in the room." She considered this for 4 seconds. Done. Kenji opened the folder. What came next arrived 62 days later. They had used the 62 days well as 62 days allowed for the preparation of something that had no precedent. The government modeling teams, which Kenji now had access to, along with the transmission data, the satellite imagery archives going back 18 months that showed the approach trajectory of the survey agents, and 3 filing cabinets worth of intercepted ionospheric communications that had been sitting in a secure facility in Hokkaido since September, unread by anyone, because no one had known what they were, had built a picture that was incomplete and terrifying and the best they could do. The Govan were not a species, they were a function. Or rather, they were a species that had become, at some point in their history, primarily a function, the colonization, resource extraction, and adaptive transformation of planetary environments. What had taken their civilization to that point, what the full scope of their civilization looked like, what their history was, none of this was in the data. What was in the data was their methodology. Survey, preparation, arrival. The survey had happened. The preparation, the careful clearing of specific sites in Shinjuku, the targeted movement of the smaller creature through the residential zones, had been partially interrupted. This meant the preparation was incomplete. This meant the arrival, when it came, would either repeat the preparation phase or improvise, and the models split roughly evenly on which. The arrival came on a Thursday. 3 contacts, large, comparable to the survey creature in Shinjuku, emerging from the Pacific off the coast of Chiba simultaneously. Military assets were positioned. The evacuation of the coastal prefectures had been underway for 2 weeks, conducted quietly and billed publicly as a disaster preparedness drill, which had worked better than anyone expected, and confirmed Kenji's long-held private suspicion that people were much more capable of sensible behavior in the face of genuine danger than most public institutions gave them credit for. Kenji was in Chiba, not at the coast, far enough back to have room. With Jiro, who had in the 62 days become the most efficient logistics manager Kenji had ever observed, coordinating the movement and positioning of 6 military units in 3 prefectures from a tablet and a phone with the calm, practical focus of someone who had grown up alongside an inexplicable condition and had developed the skill of treating the impossible as a scheduling problem. Jiro handed him a beer. It was a good beer this time, his preferred label, chilled. Kenji looked at it. He looked at the coast, where 3 shadows were rising from the water in the early morning light, larger than the survey creature, more complex in their architecture, more limbs, more of the instrument quality apertures, the surface geometry denser and more clearly armored, as if these units had been designed not for the careful, conservative work of assessment, but for something that required them to be harder to stop. They look different, Jiro said. They're built different. These aren't survey agents. What are they? Enforcers, I think. Or the nearest equivalent. Kenji turned the beer can in his hands, the same motion he'd been making with beer cans his whole adult life. The same thinking gesture. The survey said no engagement expected. The survey was wrong, I engaged, or something like it. So these come in to find out why and to complete what the survey started. So they're smarter, or more aggressive. I'm not sure which. He looked at the can. I'm not sure it matters. What does matter? Kenji thought about the standoff in Nerima. The 43 seconds of stillness, the sound exchange. The creature walking away. They stopped because they were uncertain, he said. Because I introduced something they hadn't accounted for. Not the ability, not the size, but the behavior. The sitting down, the waiting, the sound. None of their models had that in them. And when they don't have something in their models, he paused. They stop and assess. So you do it again. No, they've accounted for it now. Whatever they sent back, they've briefed it on the sitting down thing. If I do the same thing, it doesn't introduce uncertainty. It confirms a known variable. He opened the beer. I need to do something they haven't accounted for again. Something outside their model again. Jiro was quiet for a moment. What's outside their model? Kenji drank the beer. The pleasure was immediate and clean and very good. He let it build. He felt the threshold of approaching, the familiar swell of it. He held it there for a moment, just below the edge, in the warm, comfortable place between ordinary and transformed. They've modeled aggression. They've modeled non-aggression. They've modeled communication attempts. They've modeled human military responses. They've been here before. Not necessarily this planet. I mean, they've done this before. Many times, many planets. Their methodology is practiced. They have contingencies for almost every variable. Almost. The survey creatures stopped when I introduced a behavior they couldn't read. What they couldn't read was, is this a threat or not? The behavior looked non-threatening, but occupied a position that should have been threatening between the creature and the objective, close range, no weapon, no movement. They couldn't parse it. He looked at Jiro. They need to encounter something like that again. Not the same behavior, the same quality, the unreadable quality. What looks unreadable to something that's been doing this for 1,000 years? Kenji thought about his brother at the concrete barrier, eating a rice triangle. He thought about warm beer on a cold morning. He thought about the schoolgirl with the rabbit backpack pressing her face to the window and saying very quietly, "What is that?" Small things, he said, specifically human small things. The things we do that don't make tactical sense by any calculus that prioritizes efficiency or survival or resource acquisition. The things we do because we're human, and those are the things humans do. He finishes the beer. The transformation happened as it always happened. Not gracefully, not designed. A process of negotiation between what he was and what he became, the body working out its geometry in real time. 30 meters of something that was Den Kenji and Den Ace at the same time. The gold eyes and the hard skin and the internal luminosity, and underneath all of it, fully intact, the man who had carried a warm beer across an entire commute rather than litter. He looked at the 3 creatures coming out of the water. He looked at the city behind him. He thought about a plan that was not entirely a plan, more an orientation, a disposition, a way of meeting something that had been doing this for 1,000 years and could not be beaten by replication of its own tactics. He walked into the water to meet them. The confrontation off the coast of Chiba lasted 11 hours. The first 3 were the kind of thing the military cameras recorded faithfully, and the analysts watched on loop for weeks afterward, trying to understand what they were seeing. Denise, Kenji. But the distinction was difficult to maintain from the outside when the scale difference made the familiar human behaviors look like something else, like an alien behavior in its own right, did not attack. He also did not retreat. He did not maintain a fixed position. He moved constantly in a pattern that the Govan units clearly found difficult to model because it was not a pattern in any tactical sense. He was, in the simplest possible description, present. Actively, variably, persistently present in a way that occupied their decision-making capacity without triggering a clear threat response. He sang. This was the element that no analysis ever fully accounted for, though many tried. He sang songs he knew, train songs, advertising jingles he'd written at work, a folk song his mother had sung in the kitchen of the family apartment in Saitama when he was 6, a pop song from junior high that he'd always thought was about one thing, and later realized was about something entirely different. He sang in his own voice, which at 30 meters translated to a subsonic harmonic the Govan units clearly received, clearly processed, and clearly had no framework for. They didn't stop. They were built different, these units. They had contingencies for the sitting down behavior. They had responses prepared. The first unit moved on him at the 40-minute mark, and he met it not with force but with the specific variety of resistance that a person offers when they genuinely don't want to fight but will absolutely not move. A planted stance, hands up and open, and a sound that was somewhere between the tone he produced in Narima and something new, something he found as he needed it, the way he always found things in the Den Ace state. Reaching for what the body knew before the brain did. The force he used was the minimum necessary. The minimum necessary was still considerable, but the point was not the force. The point was what happened after. He sat with the unit he'd restrained, held against the ground in the shallow water off Chiba, arms pinning the creature without crushing it, face close to that flat rotating aperture, and he talked to it, not in its language, in his own. He talked the way people talk when they're running on adrenaline and deep tiredness, and something underneath, both of those that is older and harder to name, honestly. He talked about the city behind him, about the woman he'd loved at 19 under the paper lantern, about warm beer and cold mornings, and the specific pleasure of a rice triangle eaten in a crisis, because your brother had thought ahead. He talked about the school in Narima, about why that particular objective had required him to plant himself in front of it without moving. He had no idea if the creature understood a single word. He thought it might understand the quality of it, the texture of a speech that prioritized precision over efficiency, that wasted time on specific details that served no tactical purpose. It was the most human thing he could think of doing, and the most alien thing he could think of, from the perspective of a species that had been perfecting the efficient execution of planetary transformation for 1,000 years. The other two units had stopped. Not because he was holding the first one, they could have moved. Physically, they were unimpeded. They had stopped because they were processing. He could feel it, the same way he'd felt the assessment in Narima, the scanning quality, the calculation happening somewhere in the architecture of those instrument face apertures. He kept talking. 4 hours in, the military wanted to engage. He'd been briefed on this contingency. The woman at the head of the table had told him there was a threshold, a point at which the risk calculus for further restraint exceeded the risk calculus for military action, and that threshold was defined by specific criteria that she had listed, and that he had memorized, and that he was monitoring even while he talked. Jiro, on the command frequency in his earpiece, was monitoring the same criteria. Jiro's voice was steady and precise and came to him in the Den Ace state with unusual clarity, as if the transformation sharpened everything. All the inputs made the world more itself. Threshold criteria are holding, Jiro said. Units 2 and 3 still stationary. Unit 1 is, the analysts are saying something about the surface geometry of Unit 1 changing. Something's happening to the texture of it. Kenji had felt it before the cameras had picked it up. The creature beneath his hands was doing something that he didn't have a word for. Softening was the closest thing. The architecture of its surface, that dense, unresolvable quality, was becoming, not simpler, but differently complex. The way something becomes differently complex when it stops defending itself. Unit 2 is moving, Jiro said. Not toward you. It's moving toward a pause. It's turning around. Kenji looked up. Unit 2 had turned and was facing away from the coast. Facing away from the city, it stood there in the shallow water, facing the open Pacific, and did not move. Unit 3 followed suit. Kenji released Unit 1. Slowly, the way you release something you're not sure about, giving it room to choose. He moved back, not far, far enough to make the choice available. Unit 1 remained on the seabed in the shallow water for a long time. Long enough that the analyst watching the footage would later mark this period as the most significant of the 11 hours. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of the stillness of it. Two things in shallow water, neither attacking, neither retreating, occupying the same water. Then Unit 1 rose. It turned. It joined the other two facing the Pacific. Then all three of them walked into the deep water and did not surface. The debrief took 4 days. Kenji answered every question. He answered them with the same orientation he'd used in the water, precisely. Honestly, wasting time on specific details that seemed to have no tactical value, but which were, in his understanding, the whole point. The analysts and the modelers and the xenobiologists and people in the corners who said nothing listened to all of it and generated reports that would eventually, after several rounds of classification review, reach a stack height of approximately 30 centimeters in a format that no one would read completely. He told them, "I don't think they're gone. I think they've gone back to report. I think what they're reporting is something outside their model. I think that will either cause them to revise their methodology or cause them to escalate, and I don't know which, and I don't think anyone in this building knows which, and that uncertainty is the most important thing we have right now." He told them, the thing they couldn't process was not the ability, it was the humanity, specifically the unnecessary humanity, the wasted words, the small irrelevant details, the choice to sit and talk rather than fight or run, the songs, something about the inefficiency of it, the waste of it, the stubborn refusal to be purely tactical was a variable they couldn't model because their entire civilization had been optimized around the removal of exactly this kind of variable. He told them, this is not a permanent solution. I sat with one of them for 11 hours and talked about warm beer, and that bought us time, and time is what we needed, but time is not safety, and I won't pretend otherwise. The woman at the head of the table listened to all of it. On the 4th day of the debrief, at the end, she said something he hadn't expected. Before this, she said, "What did you do for work, copywriting, advertising? Were you good at it?" Moderate. I was good at the part where you understand what something is trying to say and help it say that thing more clearly. I was less good at the part where you make people want things they didn't know they wanted. She was quiet for a moment. That's what you did in the water. Kenji looked at her. You understood what something was trying to do, and you helped it understand something about itself, something it hadn't accounted for. She picked up a pen. We've been thinking about this as a defense problem. Assets, positioning, response capability. I think it might be a different kind of problem. What kind? A translation problem. She set the pen down. Something that needs to be understood before it can be answered. Kenji thought about the creature in Narima. The 43 seconds. The sound exchange. Yes, he said. I think that's right. The winter came. The city healed in the way cities heal, not completely. Not without scar, but with the particular resilient pragmatism of a place that has too much to do to stop doing it. Kenji moved back into his apartment. His apartment building had survived, which he learned with an emotion he wasn't equipped to describe. He repaired the small things that had been damaged in the evacuation. A broken window latch, a bookshelf that had tipped, a coffee maker that had somehow survived the shelf falling, but had developed a grinding noise in the heating element that suggested it was making an effort. He worked with the government team 2 days a week and spent the rest of his time in a quiet that was not peace exactly, but was perhaps closest available approximation. Jiro came for dinner on Fridays. They cooked, which was Jiro's contribution to the arrangement. He was a considerably better cook than Kenji, and made no secret of finding Kenji's approach to the kitchen philosophically irresponsible. They ate and drank decent beer and talked about things that were not the Go van, mostly, and sometimes about things that were, but without urgency, with the quality of two people who have established that they will deal with the thing when the thing requires dealing with, and in the meantime will eat properly and keep up with their lives. Kenji went back to some copywriting work. The agency had survived, relocated to a different building in a different district, operating with reduced capacity, and the specific haunted but functional energy of an organization that had lost some of its people, and was carrying that weight while moving forward, because moving forward was the only direction available. He was glad for the work. There was a particular clarity to trying to understand what a thing was trying to say, and helping it say that more clearly. He was better at it than he'd told the woman at the head of the table. He went to the reconstruction zones in Shinjuku some evenings, not to do anything specific, just to be present in the place where it had happened, to see the work. Teams in high-visibility vests and hard hats, the bone and muscle labor of reassembly. the steady, patient reinstatement of the ordinary. He stood at a respectful distance and watched and felt something that he thought might be, without being sentimental about it, something like hope. Not the large declarative kind, the small functional kind. The evidence that when the thing stops, people begin. He thought about the creatures in the water. He thought about the quality of Unit 1's surface changing under his hands. He thought about what it meant that they had all three turned away together. He thought about what it meant that something encountering the unnecessary, the inefficient, the stubbornly and irreducibly human could go still. He didn't know if it meant anything that would hold. He didn't know if the next thing that came would be more of the same, or something categorically different, something built against the variable he'd introduced, some new unit optimized for exactly the quality of encounter he'd discovered. He didn't know. He had said as much to the government team, who had appreciated the honesty and found it frustrating in exactly equal measure. What he knew was this: they had been here before, the Govan. Many places, many times. The methodology was practiced. And somewhere in the data, in the transmission from Hokkaido, in the satellite archives, in the behavioral patterns, there might be evidence of other planets, other assessments, other places that had been prepared and transformed. The xenobiology team was looking. The translation team was looking. 62 days had become months, and the work was ongoing. And Kenji sat in on those sessions and listened carefully and asked questions, and sometimes, rarely, said things that caused the room to be quiet for a moment, in a way that felt like a shift. He was not a strategist. He was not a scholar. He was a copywriter from Saitama with a condition he hadn't asked for, and a brother who carried beer in his jacket. But he could read things. He had always been able to read things. The gap between what something was trying to say and what it was actually communicating, the texture of intent underneath behavior, it was what made him moderate rather than bad at his job. It was what had made him, improbably, useful in shallow water off the coast of Chiba. On a Friday in February, Jiro came for dinner and brought a good bottle of sake, and the news that the satellite array had picked up new ionospheric disturbances in the upper atmosphere over the Pacific, different from the previous signature. Not an approach vector, but something more like a relay station. A communication point. A message being received or sent, or both. They ate. They drank the sake. They talked for a long time about their parents, about Saitama, about a summer when they were children, and their father had taken them to a festival with paper lanterns and a band that played something loud and good. They talked about what to do with the time they had. Whatever they're sending, Jiro said, it's going to be different from last time. Yes, because last time didn't work. Didn't work for them, Kenji said. Worked for us. Jiro poured more sake. What does that mean? Kenji thought about it. It means we have data now too. We know some things about what they respond to, what produces the stillness, what introduces the uncertainty they can't model. He turned his cup in his hands. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. No, it's not everything. He looked at the window. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary late winter way, light from 100,000 windows, the sound of traffic and voices, the particular texture of a place that has been damaged and is still here. But it's a start, and starts are what you work with. Jiro looked at him for a moment, then he said, "You've changed." Kenji considered this. Maybe. Not the ability thing, the other thing. The certainty of it. You used to talk about all of this like it was a problem you were stuck with. Now you talk about it like it's a thing you chose. Kenji didn't answer immediately. He thought about the train platform in October, the warm beer in the coat pocket, the choice to carry it rather than leave it somewhere for someone else to clean up. He thought about all the small, impractical, inefficient human choices that had preceded and surrounded the large ones, and how they were the same impulse, and how the same impulse had, in shallow water off the coast of Chiba, constituted humanity's best available defense. I think, he said slowly, that I've figured out that they're not different things. The condition, and the rest of it, I always thought of them as separate, the thing I can do and the person I am when I'm not doing it. But they're not. The person I am when I'm not doing it is the only reason the thing I can do means anything. He paused. If I were someone who could do this, but didn't think the small things mattered, I would have fought them in Narima, and it would have gone differently. The reasons the sitting down worked was because I was the kind of person who sits down, not as a tactic, as a disposition. Jiro was quiet. The Govan have been doing this for 1,000 years, Kenji said. And in 1,000 years of doing it, they've gotten very good at modeling every kind of fighting. And they've gotten used to being the only variable that doesn't fit into someone else's model. He looked at Jiro. The thing they can't model is a person. Outside, the satellite relay continued its transmissions across the upper atmosphere of a planet that had been assessed and prepared, and then, in the careful practiced methodology of a civilization that had been removing variables for 1,000 years, had introduced a new one. A man with a condition he hadn't asked for, sitting cross-legged in the water, singing advertising jingles. The most human thing in the observable universe. The most alien thing they had ever encountered. Spring came to Tokyo the way spring always did. Suddenly, completely, with the specific extravagance of a city that takes no season for granted. The cherry trees bloomed along the Meguro River, and the parks filled, and people brought their blankets and their drinks and sat under the blossoms, with the focused appreciation of people who know that the beautiful thing is brief. Kenji went to Shinjuku Gyoen on a Saturday. He sat under a cherry tree and drank a beer, his preferred label, chilled and watched the blossoms. Around him, families, couples, groups of friends with too much food, and not enough blanket space, all of the ordinary, irreducible business of people living their lives in the presence of something beautiful, wasting time on it, as humans have always done, and as no model had ever accounted for. His phone buzzed. A message from the woman at the head of the table. New transmission decoded. Come Monday. He read the message. He put the phone away. He looked at the cherry blossoms. He thought, whatever it says, it will say something about what they found here. Something that went back in the report that the 3 units off Chibus sent when they turned around and walked into the deep water. Something that has been processed and analyzed and responded to by a civilization that has been doing this for 1,000 years and has just encountered something outside its model for the first time in a very long time. He didn't know what the message said. He didn't know what was coming. He knew it was coming. He drank his beer. He watched the blossoms. Around him, the city lived, as the city had been living through everything that had ever been thrown at it, impractically, stubbornly, with the specific warm persistence of a thing that refuses to reduce itself to the purely functional, that insists on sitting under cherry trees in April with beer and blankets and more food than it needs, wasting time on the beautiful and the brief and the entirely unnecessary. It was, Kenji thought, the most dangerous thing about them. It was also, he thought, the only thing worth defending. He finished the beer. He set the can down carefully beside him, rather than leave it where someone else might have to pick it up. A small thing, an impractical thing, the kind of thing that had, against all probability, turned out to matter. He let the sun fall on his face and felt, completely and without apology, the uncomplicated animal pleasure of being alive on a warm spring afternoon under a tree in full bloom. The threshold hummed, distant and content, and was still. He went back to the government building on Monday. The room was full, not just the usual core team, the analysts, the linguists, the corner-sitters, but people he hadn't seen before, from agencies whose names were acronyms he didn't recognize, and a man in civilian clothes who had the specific quality of someone who had spent many years making decisions that other people didn't know about, and was entirely comfortable with that. The woman at the head of the table did not begin with pleasantries. The new transmission, she said, is in 2 parts. The first part is a revised assessment of the original survey failure. It identifies 2 variables that the original survey agents encountered and could not model. The first is the ability, the transformation. She looked at Kenji. The second is characterized in the translation team's best rendering as non-instrumental behavioral persistence in proximity to threatened assets. Kenji thought about this for a moment, sitting down. Yes, or what it represents. The choice to remain present without tactical justification. She picked up a folder. The second part of the transmission is not addressed to a command center or a fleet. It is addressed, as best the translation team can determine, to the planet. The room was quiet. What does it say? Kenji asked. She opened the folder. The translation team's rendering was careful and qualified and marked with asterisks at every point where confidence fell below 90%, which was most of it. But the core of it, the thing underneath the linguistic uncertainty, was clear enough. The transmission said, anomaly cataloged. Planet designated untranslatable possesses assessment disruptive variable of type untranslatable, nearest equivalent, ethical irrationality, compassionate inefficiency, inexplicable stubborn warmth. Standard colonization protocol suspended pending review. Fleet assets redirected duration, open, not a fixed quarantine period, not a scheduled reassessment, open. It means they're not coming back on a schedule, the woman said. It means they've escalated the classification of this planet to something that requires a different kind of decision than they were equipped to make in the field. That could be good, someone said. Or it could mean they're building something specifically designed to counter the variable, said someone else. Yes, the woman said. Both are possible. Both are being modeled. Kenji was looking at the translated text. The phrase the team had rendered as ethical irrationality, compassionate inefficiency, inexplicable stubborn warmth. 3 attempts to translate a single Govan concept that had no direct equivalent. The thing they'd encountered that they hadn't been able to process. The thing that had stopped the survey. The thing that had turned 3 enforcement units around in the water, off Chiba, and sent them back to report. The thing humans had no name for either, because they'd never needed one. It was just what people were, when they were being themselves. He thought about the cherry trees. He thought about the beer can. He thought about the school in Narima, and the choice to plant himself in front of it, not because the tactical calculus supported it, but because the alternative was something he couldn't live with, and that was all the calculation that had existed in that moment. What do we do? Someone asked. Kenji looked up from the translation. We do what we always do, he said. We carry on. He paused. We carry on in the specific way we carry on, the way that apparently no one else in the observable universe has found a way to model. He looked around the room, at the analysts and the linguists and the corner sitters and the man from the agency whose acronym he didn't recognize, all of them watching him with the expression of people who are waiting for something to tell them what to do. We don't pretend we aren't afraid. We don't pretend this is resolved. We don't optimize for pure survival. We live the way we live, the impractical way, the way with the cherry trees and the warm beer, and the sitting down in front of things when there's no tactical reason to sit down. Because that's not a vulnerability, that's the variable. That's the thing they flew across, however many light years they crossed to come here. And found and still, after all of their modeling and all of their methodology, can't account for. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Jiro, who was sitting at the end of the table with his tablet and his phone and his inexhaustible logistics calm, said, also, maybe build some better emergency infrastructure, because the evacuation coordination in Chiba was a mess. This broke something in the room. A small sound, not quite laughter, not quite relief, something between the two, the specific human sound of people recognizing that the ordinary and the extraordinary are not separate categories. Yes, the woman said, and there was something in her voice that Kenji thought might be the closest she got to amusement. That too. The months that followed were a particular kind of ordinary, the kind that exists under the awareness that it is not permanent, that something is coming, that the open duration of the fleet's redirection will eventually close and close into something specific. The satellite array continued to detect the relay transmissions. The translation team continued its slow and careful work. The xenobiology teams published in classified documents that Kenji read and sometimes annotated with questions that the xenobiologists found irritating and occasionally useful, their evolving models of Govan cognition and decision architecture. Kenji continued working with the government team 2 days a week. He continued writing copy 3 days a week, which the woman at the head of the table had suggested might be better rounded down to 2, and which he had declined to round down, because the work mattered to him, and he was not going to reduce his life to the purely defensive. He told her this in exactly those terms. She had looked at him for a moment and then said, "That's probably wise." He thought about the translation teams rendering often. Ethical irrationality, compassionate inefficiency, inexplicable stubborn warmth. 3 phrases for one thing. He thought about what it would look like to find a single phrase for it. He was a copywriter. Finding the right words for the thing underneath the thing was what he did. He never found a single phrase that satisfied him. He thought this was probably correct. Some things resist the single phrase. Some things need the 3 inadequate attempts, because the truth of them is too large and too specific and too irreducibly human to fit into anything. A language had been built to hold. On a Friday in early summer, he went to Shinjuku. The reconstruction was advanced enough by now that the difference between the repaired district and the untouched one was visible only in the newness of certain surfaces, the too bright concrete of rebuilt facades, the fresh asphalt of repaved streets, the small telltale signs of recent construction. Everywhere you looked if you were looking for them. The cherry trees along the main boulevard had survived mostly intact. The ones that hadn't had been replanted, smaller, newer, already sending out their first exploratory branches. He stood in the street where one of the creature's footsteps had been, which was now a repaved intersection with working traffic lights, and a new bus stop with a bench and a small planter box that someone had filled with marigolds. He stood there for a while and looked at the marigolds and thought about the scale of the creature's step and the scale of the marigolds and the ratio between them and the quality of insistence represented by the planter box. A woman walked past with a child on her back, the child wearing a backpack shaped like a cartoon rabbit. He blinked. The child looked at him from over the woman's shoulder with the frank, assessing gaze of a very small person who is not yet trained to pretend they haven't noticed something. He looked back. The child held his gaze for a long moment and then, with the absolute decisiveness of someone who has completed their assessment and rendered a verdict, gave him a thumbs up. He gave one back. The child seemed satisfied with this. They passed. He stood in the intersection for another minute. The traffic lights cycled. A bus pulled up to the new stop. People got on, people got off, the ordinary choreography of a city morning proceeding, as it always would, as it always had, with the complete indifference to the extraordinary that was either the most human thing about cities or the most city thing about humans. He could never decide which. His phone buzzed. "Jiro, dinner tonight?" "I made miso." He replied, "Yes." He walked toward the station. In his coat pocket, the familiar weight of a beer can, room temperature, the cap of a Tuesday morning. He would throw it away at the proper recycling bin at the station entrance. A small thing, an impractical thing, the kind of thing that had, against all expectation and against all the models that a civilization of 1,000 years of practice had built, to account for every variable a planet could produce, turned out to be the thing. He walked into the station. As the city moved around him, the ordinary city, the city of warm beer and cherry trees and rabbit backpacks and rice triangles eaten on concrete barriers by brothers who thought ahead and small, planters full of marigolds in the footprint of something ancient and terrible, and still somehow in the end persuadable. He bought a ticket. He got on the train. He went home. The relay transmissions continued through summer and into autumn. The translation team decoded them in pieces, the way all hard things are decoded, slowly, with argument, with revisions that felt like setbacks and turned out to be corrections. By October, the picture was clearer. The Govan did not have a word for what they had found on Earth. They had never needed one before. In 1,000 years of survey and preparation and transformation, they had encountered resistance. Physical resistance, organized resistance, the resistance of civilizations that had seen them coming and built in response. They had encountered despair, the stillness of species that had stopped before being stopped. They had a word for all of these. They did not have a word for a civilization that had seen them coming and planted marigolds in their footprint. The translation team's lead linguist presented this finding in a room full of military and intelligence personnel with the kind of quiet, dazed satisfaction of someone who has spent 10 months on a problem and has just found the center of it, she said. What we're reading in these transmissions is not tactical analysis. It's something closer to philosophical disruption. They're trying to categorize us, and the category doesn't exist. Good, said the man from the agency with the acronym Kenji didn't recognize. Let's keep it that way. Kenji, sitting at the end of the table, thought, we don't have to try. It's what we are. The only thing we have to do is keep being it. He thought about the school in Narima. He thought about sitting in the water for 11 hours. He thought about what the woman at the head of the table had said. Not a defense problem. A translation problem. He was beginning to understand what she had meant. And he was beginning to understand that it was bigger than she had meant it. It wasn't just about translating their language, or their behavior, or their tactical calculus. It was about the possibility that, given enough time and enough encounters of a specific quality, something might be translated in the other direction too. Something of what the Govan couldn't model might eventually, over a long enough period, become something they could. He didn't know if that was hope. He wasn't sure if hope was the right word for something that might take longer than his lifetime and required outcomes he couldn't predict and depended on variables he couldn't control. But it was something. It was the thing underneath the thing that the three inadequate translations were all reaching toward. He had not found the single phrase. But sitting in that room in October, watching the translation team's lead linguist show slides of decoded Govan transmissions to a room full of people who were slowly, carefully, imperfectly figuring out how to be the variable that 1,000-year-old civilization had no model for, he thought he might be getting closer. Outside the window, the city moved. Somewhere in the upper atmosphere, signals passed between stars. Somewhere in the deep water off the coast, perhaps, something was still processing what it had encountered in the shallows. A man with a beer can, a thumbs up from a child in a rabbit backpack, marigolds in a footprint, the inexplicable, stubborn warmth of a species that had somehow made it this far by refusing, comprehensively and at every scale, to be only what survival strictly required. Kenji picked up his pen. He wrote 3 words at the top of his notepad, then crossed them out. He wrote 3 more. He looked at them. He crossed those out too. The thing he was trying to name kept slipping past the language. It always would. That was probably the point.